For over 3 decades, Dorian Yates remained silent. The six-time Mr. Olympia champion who redefined modern physique standards watched as Arnold Schwarzenegger's reputation grew beyond the sport itself. At 63, the British bodybuilding champion, known for direct communication and discipline, decided to speak publicly. His statements about Arnold created significant discussion throughout the bodybuilding community. This extends beyond a typical rivalry between champions. It involves a 1980 competition that remains controversial, an event that major networks declined to broadcast, and footage that became unavailable to the public. It involves Yates' mentor, whose career was impacted in a single evening by what many consider one of bodybuilding's most disputed outcomes. According to Yates, Arnold Schwarzenegger was central to these events. Dorian Yates and Arnold Schwarzenegger never competed on the same stage. When Arnold dominated the Olympia in the 1970s, Yates was a teenager in Birmingham, England, working construction. When Yates emerged as a competitor in the early 1990s, Arnold had moved into film and politics. They represent different eras of bodybuilding, separated by more than a decade of the sport's development. Despite never competing directly, these two figures have been involved in one of bodybuilding's most sustained public disagreements. There were no direct confrontations or competitions for the Sandow Trophy, only years of public statements, criticism, and ongoing tension. Most sports rivalries developed from direct competition between athletes on the same stage. This situation developed differently. Yates has been direct in his criticism. In interviews, he has made statements that drew attention throughout the bodybuilding community. Most notably, he stated that Arnold no longer understands the current state of the sport. He did not simply express disagreement or different perspectives. Yates specifically said the seven-time Mr. Olympia champion had become disconnected from bodybuilding to the point where his commentary lacked relevance. From someone as measured as Dorian Yates, these statements carried considerable weight. One established champion was essentially stating that another had become disconnected from the sport he helped develop. Yates also noted that Arnold no longer attends Mr. Olympia competitions. While other former champions maintain connections to the sport and support newer competitors, Arnold pursued careers in Hollywood, politics, and business. According to Yates, this distance resulted in someone critiquing a sport from the outside rather than from informed involvement. This was not simply about absence or disconnection. There was a more specific source of Yates's criticism, something that had affected him for years. It traced back to a single night that created lasting controversy in bodybuilding. To understand Dorian Yates's lasting resentment toward Arnold Schwarzenegger, it's necessary to understand his relationship with Mike Mentzer. Mentzer was more than someone Yates admired from a distance. He was the foundation of everything Yates became as a bodybuilder. In the late 1980s, while Yates was still developing his approach to training, he encountered Mentzer's training philosophy known as high-intensity training, or HIT. At a time when most bodybuilders were spending 5 or 6 hours in the gym performing high-volume workouts like those Arnold advocated, Mentzer proposed something fundamentally different. Brief, intense training sessions focused on pushing muscles to complete failure, then allowing time for recovery and growth. Yates adopted this philosophy and used it to transform himself from a competitive amateur into what many considered an unprecedented physique in professional bodybuilding. He credited Mentzer as his mentor and the source of his competitive approach. For Mentzer, Yates represented validation, concrete evidence that his training methods produced results at the highest level. The connection between them extended beyond a typical mentor-student dynamic. It was both personal and profound. This is why the events that affected Mentzer in 1980 became significant to Yates as well. In October 1980, the Mr. Olympia competition took place in Sydney, Australia. This event is widely regarded as the most disputed outcome in bodybuilding history. Mike Mentzer entered the competition as one of the expected contenders. He had won the heavyweight division the previous year with a perfect score, the first and only time that had occurred in the competition's history. His conditioning and physique were considered excellent, and he was expected to compete seriously for the overall title. Then Arnold Schwarzenegger, who had retired from competitive bodybuilding 5 years earlier after his 6th Olympia victory, announced he would return to compete. Arnold had been retired since 1975 and had begun transitioning into acting. His decision to compete came with only 8 weeks of preparation, a fraction of the time most elite competitors dedicate to contest prep. The announcement generated mixed reactions, some enthusiasm, but also immediate skepticism. Arnold wasn't simply returning to participate. He was there with the intention of winning, and according to many who attended the event, the outcome appeared predetermined. When the final results were announced, the response from the audience was immediate and negative. Arnold Schwarzenegger was named the winner of the 1980 Mr. Olympia, and the crowd reacted with sustained booing. Mike Mentzer, who had achieved a perfect score just 12 months earlier, placed 5th behind Arnold, Chris Dickerson, Frank Zane, and Boyako. People who were backstage reported that Mentzer appeared genuinely devastated by the result. He had prepared extensively, reached what he believed was peak condition, and the outcome felt arbitrary rather than merit-based. The backstage environment became tense. Mentzer was visibly upset and confronted Arnold directly. According to witnesses, the exchange nearly became physical, with others intervening before the situation escalated further. Mentzer, known for his intellectual approach and emphasis on disciplined thinking, was reportedly ready to fight because he believed the decision had nothing to do with who deserved to win based on their physique. Instead, it appeared to be influenced by politics and star power, awarding the title to the most famous competitor regardless of objective merit. The impact of that night extended beyond the immediate disappointment. Mentzer competed once more in 1981, then retired from bodybuilding entirely, a figure who had introduced influential training concepts and who had the potential for sustained success at the highest level, never competed again. Dorian Yates observed what he interpreted as the politically motivated destruction of his mentor's competitive career, with Arnold Schwarzenegger at the center of it. The 1980 Mr. Olympia was controversial not only because of the outcome, but because of how blatant the apparent setup was. When Dorian Yates began speaking openly about that night, he pointed to something he believed should have disqualified the entire competition. The judging panel included several of Arnold's personal friends. These were not simply admirers or people who respected his legacy, but individuals who had direct connections to Arnold, people who had trained with him and maintained financial and personal relationships with the Austrian oak. Despite this, no action was taken by those in charge. In most legitimate sporting competitions, such conflicts of interest would trigger an investigation. A boxing match with judges connected to one fighter, or a football game with referees maintaining business relationships with a team owner would be considered scandalous. Yet in 1980 at the Mr. Olympia, Arnold's associates sat on the judging panel and awarded him the trophy while the crowd booed and competitors stood backstage in disbelief. According to Yates, the problems went beyond the judging itself. Yates has stated multiple times over the years that Arnold purchased all the footage from that competition. Every angle, every shot, every piece of video evidence that could document Arnold's conditioning that night. According to Yates, the full 1980 Mr. Olympia is no longer available for public viewing because Arnold ensured its removal. While some grainy clips exist online, the complete high-quality broadcast has not been accessible. If Arnold's physique was genuinely superior that night, the question becomes why the evidence would need to be concealed. Champions typically celebrate their victories and use them to reinforce their legacy. If the reports are accurate, Arnold did the opposite, allegedly spending money to prevent future audiences from watching the competition and forming their own judgments. This pattern suggests something other than a clean victory. The concerns were not limited to fans and commentators. CBS, the major television network scheduled to broadcast the event, conducted its own investigation. After reviewing what had occurred, the network refused to air the competition. A major broadcaster, despite existing advertising agreements and contracts, walked away rather than be associated with the event. When a corporation prioritizes protecting its reputation over fulfilling a broadcasting contract, it indicates serious underlying issues. The fallout extended into the following year. Frank Zane, a three-time Mr. Olympia champion and one of the sport's most respected figures, boycotted the 1981 competition. Boyer Coe, who placed fourth behind Arnold in 1980, also refused to compete the following year. Mike Mentzer appeared at the 1981 Olympia only to make a statement before walking away from competitive bodybuilding entirely, reportedly disgusted with the direction of the sport. 3 elite competitors all refused to participate, each sending the same message. What happened in 1980 was unacceptable. For Mentzer, that night marked what many in bodybuilding still refer to as the stolen watch moment. His career, his ambitions, his future as a champion were all derailed by a decision widely viewed as corrupt, one that sent shockwaves through the industry. He never fully recovered mentally. The man who had achieved what many considered perfection on stage, who had revolutionized training science, who might have dominated the 1980s with multiple Olympia titles, instead spent those years in decline. His mental health deteriorated, his relationships collapsed, and the sport he loved became something he could barely tolerate. Dorian Yates witnessed all of this happening to the man who had taught him everything. His decades-long criticism of Arnold stems directly from this history. Beyond the personal grievance over what happened to Mentzer, there's another dimension to this rivalry that runs equally deep. Arnold and Yates don't simply disagree about one controversial night in 1980. They represent fundamentally opposed philosophies about training and bodybuilding itself. That philosophical divide has sustained decades of mutual criticism. Arnold's training approach was defined by volume. He spent 5 hours in the gym during marathon sessions, sometimes training twice daily. The regimen consisted of extensive sets, extensive repetitions, extensive time under the weights. He would work chest from multiple angles, performing set after set until his muscles were fully pumped and exhausted, then return hours later to repeat the process. This was the golden era methodology. More is more. Spend the entire day in the gym, make bodybuilding your complete focus, and accumulate volume until the body is forced to grow. Yates regarded that approach as fundamentally flawed. He has stated directly in interviews that the methods from Arnold's era made no sense to him. Why spend 5 hours accomplishing what could be done in 1? Why expend energy on 20 sets when 3 sets taken to absolute failure would trigger the same growth response? This wasn't simply a difference in training preference. Yates was asserting that everything Arnold advocated was inefficient, outdated, and wrong. He built his career on demonstrating that the golden era approach was inferior, and he did demonstrate it. Yates would enter the gym, spend 60 minutes pushing his muscles to complete failure through high-intensity training, then leave and develop into a physique that surpassed Arnold's in size. No 5-hour sessions, no twice-daily workouts, just concentrated, extreme intensity that pushed his body beyond previous limits. He didn't simply win 6 consecutive Mr. Olympia titles. He redefined what a champion's physique looked like. Larger, denser, more conditioned, more extreme. The mass monster era emerged, and Dorian Yates was its originator. As Yates and the champions who followed him continued pushing size to new extremes, Arnold began publicly criticizing modern bodybuilding. In interviews, he argued that the sport had lost its aesthetic appeal, that physiques had become too large and departed too far from the classical proportions and symmetry that defined his era. Arnold wanted bodybuilding to return to the look of Greek statues, to the standards of his generation. Yates responded directly. Arnold's criticism, whether explicitly stated or not, suggested that Yates had damaged bodybuilding, that the revolution Yates pioneered was a mistake, that the mass monster era represented a corruption of the sport. Yates countered with a pointed question. If Arnold cared so much about bodybuilding, why didn't he attend Mr. Olympia anymore? The question carried weight because it was accurate. Arnold had become a distant critic, someone who had left the sport decades earlier for Hollywood and politics, yet still offered judgments about how current champions were approaching the discipline. He wasn't present at competitions. He wasn't backstage with athletes. He wasn't even in the audience. Meanwhile, he occasionally commented in interviews about how bodybuilding had lost its direction, while competitors dedicated to the sport trained consistently. Yates identified what he saw as a contradiction. Arnold was criticizing modern bodybuilding while declining to engage with it, having not attended competitions in years. Arnold appeared to want the sport to remain unchanged from the 1970s, fixed in the image of his era. Yates rejected this view. The sport had evolved, training methods had evolved, and physiques had evolved. If Arnold couldn't accept that, Yates suggested, perhaps it was because approaches from Arnold's era had been surpassed. For years, the disagreement remained mostly subdued. Occasional remarks and indirect references circulated within the bodybuilding community. But in 2013, Dorian Yates addressed the issue directly. In an interview that generated significant attention in the fitness world, he criticized Arnold Schwarzenegger without reservation. Yates called Arnold ignorant about the current state of the sport. He stated that Arnold no longer knew much about bodybuilding, attributing this to a simple fact: Arnold never attended Mr. Olympia. While former champions like Lee Haney, Ronnie Coleman, and Jay Cutler remained connected to bodybuilding by attending events, mentoring younger athletes, and staying involved in the community, Arnold had distanced himself. According to Yates, this absence undermined Arnold's credibility to assess the direction of the sport. Mr. Olympia is bodybuilding's premier competition, the event every competitor aspires to reach. Former champions attending represents both tradition and respect, a connection to the foundations of their success. Arnold, however, did not attend. He focused on film projects, his tenure as California's governor, business ventures, and building his broader empire. For those who remained dedicated to bodybuilding, the sport had become secondary in Arnold's public narrative, something from his past before his wider fame. For competitors who devoted their careers to bodybuilding, this shift was notable. Arnold's transformation was clear. He went from bodybuilder who acted to actor who had bodybuilded. He moved away from that identity, shifting from muscle magazines to movie premieres, from Gold's Gym to Hollywood studios. Arnold became one of the biggest action stars in the world, then entered politics and served as governor of California. That level of success extended far beyond bodybuilding, but the issue was one of consistency. He had left the sport, stayed away from it for decades, and skipped every major competition. Then he began offering criticisms about modern bodybuilders being too big, or the sport losing its direction. Arnold kept doing this, and Yates kept responding. When Arnold gave interviews about bodybuilding needing to return to the aesthetic standards of his era, Yates would point out that Arnold had given up his standing to make those criticisms when he stopped participating. Yates wasn't just defending himself. He was defending an entire generation of bodybuilders who advanced the sport while Arnold worked in Hollywood. Champions like Ronnie Coleman, Jay Cutler, and Phil Heath embraced the mass monster era and developed physiques that would have been impossible in the 1970s. Arnold's criticism extended beyond Yates to everyone who came after him, everyone who evolved beyond what his generation had achieved. Yates took this personally because he understood what it represented: jealousy disguised as concern. The irony is substantial. Arnold built his legacy as the biggest, most dominant bodybuilder of his time. He won Olympias not primarily for aesthetic beauty, but because he was more massive, more imposing, and more physically impressive than his competitors. He pushed size and mass to the limits of what was possible in the 1970s. Yates came along and pushed those limits further, doing what Arnold had done but at a higher level. Instead of acknowledging that evolution, Arnold criticized it. He criticized the same approach he had used, simply because someone had executed it better. Yates recognized this. It wasn't about protecting bodybuilding's integrity or preserving classical aesthetics. Arnold couldn't accept that his era had been surpassed. The physiques of the 1990s and 2000s made his 1970s dominance look modest by comparison. Bodybuilding had moved forward without him, evolved past him, and created new standards his generation never reached. Rather than accept this, Arnold positioned himself as bodybuilding's guardian, criticizing from a distance while refusing to engage with the sport he claimed to value. Yates wasn't willing to let that hypocrisy stand. In December 2024, Joe Rogan made a comment on his podcast that reignited the debate between Arnold Schwarzenegger and Dorian Yates. Rogan said he preferred Arnold's physique over Yates's, positioning it not just as personal taste, but as a statement about what bodybuilding should represent. The comment reached millions of listeners, many of whom don't follow bodybuilding closely, and spread rapidly across social media. People divided into camps, debating aesthetics versus mass, classical proportions versus modern development. Rogan had never competed in bodybuilding, yet his comment carried weight because of his platform's reach. Yates didn't respond directly, but the timing was notable. At 63, Yates maintained a physique that demonstrated the effectiveness of his training methods beyond competition. He remained lean, muscular, and well-conditioned, showing that high-intensity training produced sustainable results over decades. Arnold, by contrast, had discussed his multiple heart surgeries and health struggles publicly, including the physical toll from performance-enhancing substances and years of film work. Yet Rogan and others held up Arnold's physique as the ideal, while dismissing what Yates represented. In December 2025, Yates himself criticized modern Mr. Olympia competitions, stating the current era had lost something important. He praised the Arnold and Lee Haney era as a golden period for the sport. After years of defending the mass monster movement and arguing that bigger was better, Yates acknowledged that bodybuilding may have gone too far in one direction. The competitors on stage now were so massive and distended, so far beyond what he had achieved, that the sport barely resembled its original form. The relationship between Yates and Arnold contains complexity beneath the public conflict. Yates has never denied Arnold's significance as a bodybuilder. He's acknowledged Arnold's genetics, size, and impact on popularizing the sport. In interviews, he's stated that Arnold was a big man, tall and wide, with a naturally imposing frame. The disagreement was never about whether Arnold was great. It was about Arnold's unwillingness to recognize that greatness could exist beyond his era. At 63, Yates reflected on his career and bodybuilding's evolution, acknowledging that the sport may have shifted too far from its earlier balance. The era of Arnold's dominance and Yates's own reign in the early 1990s had maintained a proportion between size and aesthetics that modern bodybuilding appeared to have lost. In prioritizing mass above all else, the sport had diminished the artistic elements that once drew interest from beyond its core followers. This kind of perspective typically emerges only with age and distance from active competition. However, Yates's reflection on that era did not soften his criticisms of Arnold. While acknowledging the merits of that period, he continued to point out Arnold's departure from bodybuilding after 1980. His respect for Arnold's achievements existed alongside his objections to the 1980 contest, the presence of Arnold's associates as judges, the missing footage, the careers affected by that outcome. Yates could recognize Arnold's contributions to the sport while maintaining his position on what followed. For over 30 years, the two have maintained this relationship of respect and resentment, admiration and disagreement. They remain connected through a rivalry that never reached resolution, having never competed against each other when both were at their peak.